Moderator of the next session, Roland Freudenstein.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Brussels Freedom Hub, and I have the honor and the pleasure to moderate, to facilitate this debate where we take a look into the crystal ball, in other words, into the future of Russia. So privyet to everyone. We know that we're between you and the evening reception, so that's a special responsibility. And we're going to look at not just the immediate future, the next couple of years, but we'll put the main accent here on the post-Putin future of Russia, because at some point that man is going to leave the Kremlin. You know, in whatever shape or form, maybe not even in one piece, but yes, he will leave the Kremlin. And, you know, the mother of all questions is actually, or there are two mothers of all questions. The first one is, what kind of Russia is that going to be? Continuity, worse, better, possibly. And the other one is, how is the West going to prepare for that moment, for that post-Putin Russia? So I would like to ask to the stage the four best speakers I could imagine for this topic. So we have Theresa Fallon, the founder and director of the Brussels-based Center for Russia, Europe and Asia Studies. Theresa, come here, please.
Hey.
We have Dr. Evelyn Farkas, the Executive Director of the McCain Institute and formerly Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Eurasia. Please, Evelyn, join us here. We have Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is the Vice President of the Free Russia Foundation, for which I had the honor to work for 1 year. And he has been in 2.5 years of really tough prison for protesting against Russian aggression against Ukraine. So, special welcome. And last but by no means least, Petr Kolář, who is an advisor to the Czech president and senior advisor of Squire, Patton, Boggs. Petr, welcome. Let's all sit down. And as I said, we will start with the immediate future. Or before that, I should also, of course, make the usual Slido remark. You can ask questions on Slido. Use the QR code, which they're going to show in a minute, or we will also do analog, lifting your hand and then saying who you are and so on. So I would like to start the debate here with Petr Kolář and ask you, well, yesterday morning, German intelligence came out with a report saying essentially there are not just speculations, there are not just estimates, but there are concrete indications that Russia is planning a little green man kind of attack against a Baltic state in order to test Article 5, believing that Article 5 is not as watertight anymore as it used to be. So what can we look at in the immediate future what Putin is up to, and how is that going to influence the trajectory of Russia in the more mid-term future? Petr, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roland. Actually, I believe this is quite dependent on what President of the United States would say or do, or if he read the report from German intelligence. I would doubt about it. But Putin is the person who is testing West all time. He was testing us what we allow him to do. You know, Russia is a sick country. It has a malignant tumor, and this is called Vladimir Putin. It is a cancer. So this guy knows that everything is going to end once, but he believes that he has a mission, and the mission is to restore the Russian Empire. Or Soviet Empire, whatever. You know, for him, the worst tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we can expect that he will test us again, as he was doing it before. And every time we actually gave him chance to do it. Like in Georgia, summit of NATO in Bucharest in 2008 was for him the clear message that yes, he can invade Georgia. Because we sent those two delegations from Georgia and Ukraine home with empty hands, without being really promised to become the member of NATO. So that was the first visible test. Then others came later, Crimea and others. So it is very much dependent on us, the global West, and mostly on the United States president, if Putin would be tempted to test us in such a serious way.
So, in other words, it's up to us to deter Putin from precisely testing Article 5.
We have to show that we are really ready to use Article 5, and this is not like only something, empty shell. That NATO still works, and the United States is still in, and nuclear umbrella is working. Otherwise, this temptation of this crazy guy, who is, as I said, the malignant tumor of Russia, would be actually energized. He'll be tempted to do that.
Okay, let's move on to Theresa. You, as the name of your center says, you specialize on all the different angles that we're talking about today. And I would like you to focus a little bit on the alliances that Russia is developing at the moment, that Russia is strengthening, and how they will influence the trajectory of Russian policy in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Roland. First of all, I'm delighted to be here for the 20th anniversary and glad to see that all of you, after a very long day, are here. So it's a real honor and to be on such an amazing panel with such incredible colleagues. This morning, I listened very carefully to Zelensky's speech, and he mentioned Russia, Iran, and North Korea, but he left out China. And I then listened to the second panel, and I heard about the Baltic Sea cables being damaged, and I heard about Russia, but no one mentioned China. So there's almost a Euromnesia, is what I like to call it, about China's influence. Now, a wonderful man in Canada came up with the acronym CRINCS, so China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. So these countries are this axis of autocracies that are really challenging the system, and Russia is aligning themselves with them. It's not an alliance, but they have a convergence of interests. And the key member, because I only have 5 minutes, and that's 5 countries, and I can't even spend 1 minute on each country. So the key country in all of this is China. So the Russia-China, as we know, Xi Jinping has stated, we haven't seen these changes in 100 years. So this is a very powerful narrative for Russia-China, that they feel that the West is weak, and this is their great opportunity. So it's a very powerful narrative that we've seen Xi Jinping go to the May 9th victory parade on Red Square, and when I lived in Moscow, I never dreamt I would see Chinese soldiers marching by, and that's what happened just last month. So we're seeing incredible changes. Nevertheless, we also saw on June 7th a leakage, and I'm always skeptical when things get leaked by the FSB, but it was a long list of grievances that Russia has with China. So is this a red herring, or is it just, yes, there's always been a strain in Russia that's deeply skeptical about China, and in this relationship, Russia is actually the vassal. I mean, they are the weaker party, and let's face it, the #1 trade partner for Russia now is China. They have a lot of dependence. And in the past, Russia at least would try to sell their advanced weapons to China. China would just want to buy 1 plane, and Russia would cry and say, no, you have to buy more, because they would reverse engineer it. So now there's evidence that they're just transferring the technology. But the frightening part of this is that they are actually have a combined military-industrial defense base, which is something that should wake all of us up. That is something of deep concern. And The second issue is the Arctic. So China, Russia is very concerned about China's interests in the Arctic, and China is positioning themselves very well, as we know, as a near Arctic power that they've self-described themselves as. And the other thing is poaching technology, including scientists and advanced technological aspects. So we know that the war in Ukraine could not continue without China buying energy from Russia. Also, the dual-use exports of China to Russia to help create missile parts, other dual-use goods that go to contribute to the war in Ukraine. So this idea that China is neutral in all of this and in their political description of what they want to do and get settled out of this war is to help rebuild Ukraine. So they're trying to speak out of both sides of their mouth, and we see that Europe, with the Trump administration, we saw kind of an attempt to have a reverse Kissinger, try to pull Russia away from China, but at the same time, Europe is kind of thinking maybe we can make a deal, an economic deal with China. So the West is not speaking with one voice at all on this, and this gives an opportunity for Russia and China to drive a wedge in the transatlantic relationship. And I can feel you breathing heavily there, and I'll stop. Okay, but I was only 4 minutes.
Now it's 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. All right, Volodya, the mother of all questions. I mean, can Russia become a democracy? Is that a question for the so-called Armenian radio? Like, в принципе, да, no. In principle, yes, but. And what kind of Russia would we look at most likely after the demise of Putin, which is going to come in some way?
Thank you so much, Roland. Thank you for moderating this conversation. It's an honor to be here on the panel with colleagues, and thank you all of you for coming tonight. My answer to your first question is going to be very brief and very quick. Yes, of course, Russia can be a democracy. There's no nation in the world that is incompatible with democracy. To say otherwise, in my view, is essentially a racist argument. President Ronald Reagan, when he gave his famous Westminster address back in 1982, he said that it is cultural condescension or worse to suggest that there's any nation on the face of this earth that would voluntarily choose dictatorship over democracy. And we know that, there have been many countries in the history of humanity that have been described as, no, I mean, it's authoritarianism is in their blood, it's in their genes, it's in their history. And today all these countries, including yours, are functioning, successful, liberal democracies. But to your second question, the mother of all questions, as you put it, I'm not just a politician, I'm also a historian by education. And I always like to look at historical models because they are the clearest sort of thing we have, the closest thing we have to giving an answer to a question about the future, because there are laws and models and ways of historical development that nobody has been able to amend or annul, and Vladimir Putin is certainly not going to be an exception. The first is that major political changes in our country always happen suddenly, like this. Just two examples. Both the Tsarist regime at the beginning of the 20th century and the communist regime at the end of the 20th century collapsed in 3 days. Now, of course, it wasn't really 3 days. Václav Havel, in his famous work, Power of the Powerless, writes that the problem with totalitarian regimes is that so many processes happen outside of visibility, because all we see is the propaganda facade, by definition, because that's how these regimes function. So, of course, there are processes underneath that are preparing for this change. But the visible part was only 2 or 3 days in both cases, and nobody saw it coming. There's a very good book out last year by the University of California at Berkeley by a Russian-American sociologist called Alexei Yurchak. And it's a book about the later years of the Soviet regime. And the title of the book is It Was Forever Until It Was No More, because that's exactly how it is in Russia. And the second model, the second sort of law of history, if we look at every Russian leadership change, beginning in 1762, so beginning with Catherine the Great's coup d'etat against her husband, we will see that every time the succeeding leader, even if he or she came from within the previous leadership, has changed the course by 180 degrees. Every single one, with one exception. Konstantin Ustinovich Chernenko, he was in power for 13 months. He just had no time to do this. But everybody else, even if the next person came from the old regime, and Khrushchev was one of the closest acolytes to Stalin. He was the one who released millions of people from the Gulag. Putin was handpicked by Yeltsin. He destroyed all the achievements of Russian democracy in the 90s completely. There's nothing left, and so on. Now, that's not to say that the moment Putin goes, or to use Ambassador Kolář's metaphor, which I fully agree with, that Putin is a malign tumor in the body of our country, when that malign tumor is removed, it's not to say that, the next day there'll be flourishing democracy, of course not. All it will mean is that there will be a window of opportunity. Windows of opportunity, by definition in history, are short and brief. And that's why, Roland, I'm very grateful for the way you are sort of channeling this conversation into speaking about preparing for post-Putin Russia, because we need to do that preparing. Because one of the problems for the 90s was that the Soviet regime collapsed so suddenly, nobody was expecting it, people did not know what to do. This goes both for the Russian leadership at the time and for Western leaders at the time, and so many mistakes were made that led us to where we all are today. And so I think we should really learn from the two major mistakes, in my view, that have been made in the 90s and make sure we do not repeat them again. Because, I'm not an analyst, I'm not a prognosticator, I'm a practitioner, I'm a politician, and I always like to think in the model of, do you remember there was that famous passage from The Adventures of Alice in the Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, where Alice asks the Cheshire Cat, which way should I go? And he smiles at her and says, well, that very much depends on where you want to get to. I know where I want to get to. I know where my colleagues in the Russian democratic movement want to get to. We want Russia to become a normal, peaceful, democratic European country that will respect the rights and freedoms of its own citizens and that will respect the borders of its neighbors in the civilized norms of international behavior. And so two major mistakes that I believe we must not repeat that were made in the 90s to make sure we get to that point. Number one, on the domestic side, I think the biggest mistake President Yeltsin's team made in the 90s is that, and this is a really appropriate country to speak about this, we never really had a process of a public reflection, a public reckoning on the crimes of the communist regime. It was just sort of swept under the carpet. There were no illustrations, there were no openings of the archives, there were no judicial tribunals. The KGB was just renamed. They just changed the name on the facade, the plaque. The system remained the same. And we know that when evil is not publicly reflected on, publicly accounted for, and publicly condemned, it will return. And this is what happened in Russia. And we must not repeat that mistake. There has to be full accountability for everything that's been happening, both under the communist regime and under Putin.
And can we get to the mistakes of the West in a minute? Because I still have...
I will touch on those too.
Exactly. But I still have a Russia question here. Vladimir, you talked about cutting out the tumor and, okay, removing Putin, would that remove all the problems in Russian society? Probably not. But if the answer is no, which are those problems? Can you enlighten us a little bit more about which obstacles are there and will be there in the given moment to democracy and post-imperial behavior in Russia itself?
It's actually the very problem I was just talking about. Our society never reflected on its totalitarian trauma. We know that every country in different historical and cultural contexts, in different continents, every country that has successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy, be it this country after the fall of communism, be it South Africa after apartheid, be it Argentina after the military junta, and so many other examples, they went through this process of a public reckoning with all the crimes that had been committed on behalf of these countries, on behalf of these societies under the previous regimes. Czechoslovakia, as it still then was the first country of the former Warsaw Pact to have passed the lustrations law back in the early 1990s. Other countries have them in different forms. I mean, as you know much better than I do, in Germany there is this national institution that handles the former Stasi archives, and everybody can come in and read his or her case. We have nothing like this in Russia. We only had very timid beginnings of this in the early 90s. There were some far-sighted people, principled people, like Galina Starovoitova, well-known lawmaker from St. Petersburg, like Vladimir Bukovsky, a very prominent Soviet-era dissident, who served as an expert on President Yeltsin's side during the Constitutional Court case against the Communist Party in 1992, who were pushing for this in the early 90s. Open the archives, make these crimes public, make sure there's accountability for these crimes. But our society never went through this. And so the problem for everything that's happening, both inside of Russia and what the Russian regime is doing outside of its own borders, the problems lie there, because there was never a reflection.
Thank you.
That's why a Soviet KGB officer could have come to power. We were never allowed to repeat the same mistake again.
Okay. Evelyn, Farkas, how should the West prepare for all this? And please also take into account the question of what mistakes were made in the 90s by the West.
Yes. So first of all, I agree. I mean, I would never contradict my colleague, who is really the expert on Russia, on this panel. And thank you for moderating, Roland. Thank you to GlobeSec for the invitation and the honor of being with these excellent people, smart and principled. Thank you. We, first of all, have to acknowledge, I think, that, as Vladimir said, we will not know, we will not have a warning, likely, when the government will change. If it changes significantly from Vladimir Putin to a new, more Western-friendly government, likely we won't know. Hopefully, we can put enough pressure on the Russian system right now to kill Vladimir Putin's foreign policy, that is, with a military defeat in Ukraine, which includes, of course, all the other levers of power, diplomatic and economic. And maybe then there's another leader, which may not necessarily be a democratic leader, but someone else from the Siloviki, from the security establishment. And Putin can go to his dacha. But so then that's a different scenario from a democratic one. But let's assume a more rosy scenario, one that's not only pro-Western, but actually a government that wants democracy. The biggest mistake we made in the West, and now I'm really going to speak for my country, is we were arrogant. So next time around, please, we should be more humble. I think we have been humbled by our own recent history with democracy and with democracy building, if you will. We should not try any economic shock to the system. We should understand that we live right now in a time when people are experiencing great economic turbulence, great identity crises, and what we don't want to do is encourage the kind of nationalism or populism that we see in our countries today to spring in Russia. So another form of non-democratic or, let's say, not liberal democracy could emerge if we're not careful. We in the West, in the United States right now, should be meeting with all opposition leaders. Of course, there are divisions among the Russian emigre community, and then, but we should meet with all of them. And we should also try to meet with Russians internally. We should keep the channels of communication open. Our intelligence communities, of course, should be involved in this, but it's very important that we not prescribe to the Russian people and their leaders, whether they're civil society leaders inside or outside the country or the actual political leadership. So I think avoiding arrogance is the most important thing. We should be prepared to assist nonetheless, so be engaged with money and advice. Where did we go wrong before? Partly it was the shock therapy. The economic advice we gave was not appropriate for the conditions, but also we were not sufficiently committed. I know this from having done some studies and watched what happened in my country. We put a lot of money into Eastern Europe, and we didn't put as much money into Russia, and frankly, there was a lot of hedging. So the lack of commitment to Russia reflected a lack of trust in the Russian people, in the Russian leadership, a fatigue because there had already been a lot of money and effort put into Eastern Europe. And so we kind of got a little more relaxed and lazy, if you will, in the West. So we should ensure that we don't do that this time around. And then the other part I have here is accountability. And I have a non-published opinion piece, so I'll just give you a little piece of it, how I started off, was right after May Day. You know, we're watching this parade where Putin and Xi are trumpeting, frankly, their invasions because they had all the forces who had invaded Ukraine in that parade, including, I think, the North Koreans as well. And then at the same time in Lviv, the EU foreign ministers were meeting to come up with to make a political declaration that they had a political agreement to start a war crimes trial proceeding against Russia for its war of aggression, specifically in Ukraine, although it may be broader than that. I didn't look at the details. And what I wrote in the piece was, you know, that day we were celebrating the end of World War II again. Well, what followed after the end of World War II, after the military guns were silenced, was Nuremberg and the trials in Japan. So it is very important to have an accounting for the Russian people to understand that their leaders in their name committed crimes, that they not be held collectively guilty, but nonetheless that they understand understand what happened. They understand the history going all the way back, and that they can somehow commit to a new future based on the real principles of the United Nations, universal principles of respecting boundaries and also human rights. So that's probably more than 5 minutes.
That was just 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Roland, could I very briefly respond before we go off the topic?
Yes.
I agree with everything Evelyn just said, and I just want to make one addition about the mistake of the 90s from the international side that must not be repeated next time. And again, this is a very appropriate country to speak of the fact how important for these former Warsaw Pact countries in the early 90s was the promise of European and Euro-Atlantic integration. How big, how strong of a stimulus, incentive it was for them to continue and persevere with democratic and market reforms. When Václav Havel addressed the American Congress in February of 1990, he termed the entire process of the post-communist transformation in Czechoslovakia then still as our return to Europe. The problem was Russia never really had that promise in the early 90s. An example I often give because it's just so striking. On the 20th of December 1991, President Boris Yeltsin of Russia wrote to Manfred Wörner, the then Secretary General of NATO, officially and publicly, for the first time ever, raising the question of future Russian membership in a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That letter never even got a reply. A few years ago, this is before prison, I was writing an article for a Polish Foreign Affairs magazine, and I went back to the sources to see how is it possible that something of this importance from the President of Russia doesn't even get responded to, and all the sources go back to the same point. The Soviet regime collapsed so suddenly, people were not even considering this possibility. And what the New York Times article from the time reported, that NATO leaders were too taken aback by this idea to offer a coherent response. This was a very big problem. And next time, this mistake must not be repeated. I absolutely agree with Evelyn, what you just said. The West has to stand ready to assist, not just with money, but also with promise of integration, that new post-Putin democratic Russia, because this is in the interest of all of us. There's never going to be peace, stability, and security on the European continent without a democratic Russia.
Okay.
That's the goal we should all work towards.
Vladimir, thank you so much for these rich contributions. I have a few Slido questions. Several of them actually address the cohesion of Russia after a possible regime change. Petr, you wanted to come in here. Please do.
Can I a bit disagree now?
You're absolutely welcome to disagree.
Yeah, thanks.
I mean,
I want to polemize a bit with. You know, you said that we were arrogant.
Well, maybe you weren't, but we Americans were.
I don't think so. From my perspective, the mistake we made was that we were driven by our wishful thinking. We didn't want to see the reality. We were just from the very beginning trying to explain to our Russian friends that they are not defeated, that Soviet communism is defeated, that they are winners as well. So let's build democratic, prosperous society in Russia. We didn't want to see that what President Yeltsin was doing, that was actually not about democratization of the country, as we were looking for it. Russians call this period Yermokratization. Yermo, you know what it means. You know that this is the insect actually. So, for them, these 90s, it was total disaster. They lost their dignity. They didn't believe in their future. They thought that those Westerners who are coming, they are just partnering with their oligarchs. There was a kleptocracy which was there. People were not getting their salaries. Nothing was in the shops. And actually then Mr. Putin came, liberator. And we believe that this is the guy, you know, he's not drinking alcohol, not smoking. He is a judo sporty guy, and he will bring the order to the country. What a naive we were. You know, we didn't want to listen what he is saying. He was sending clear messages. In this 2 months before he became the president, when Putin stepped down, Putin was sending us the messages clearly, that he believes that Russia can survive only as a superpower. So it means together with Ukraine. And, well, he was clearly expressing his view about the liberal West, corroded, corrupted. He didn't believe in our values.
Okay.
So, sorry, I just have another comments, but
This is super interesting.
I promise that
Vladimir, one sentence.
As the only Russian citizen in this panel, I feel I have the right to respond.
Okay.
The second part, I totally agree with Ambassador. Putin was sending the messages from the very beginning. One of the first things he did when he came to the Kremlin was restore the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem. What other symbols do you need? Exactly. But I vehemently disagreed with the first part of what you said. What you just said about the 90s, that's a caricature view presented by Putin's propaganda, actually. Yes, there were many economic problems. There always are when an empire collapses, in every single case. But you know what? I remember the 90s. I was growing up in Moscow in the 90s. It was the only time we did not have political prisons in Russia, when you could freely speak your mind and not go to prison for it. It was the only time we had free elections, when you actually did not know the result ahead of time, which today is a revolutionary concept. We had independent media that was pluralistic, that presented different points of view, and so on and so forth. Of course, there were all sorts of political demonstrations going on.
We got the message.
This is your view. You are intelligent.
But this is the view of a lot of people. You presented that view as if every single of 140 million Russians.
Explain me how it's possible that Putin has such a popularity. You know, the fact
popularity. Are we talking about popularity in a dictatorship?
No, well,
we're getting to some real stuff here.
Yeah, that's good.
We haven't had a free election in 25 years. How do you measure popularity?
Okay, yeah. I am not arguing with you that Mr. Putin is a dictator. Definitely not. But when I was there as the ambassador, I had a chance to talk to local people too, and those Westerners, like you are, they were not in majority. I can guarantee that this is not like that. I was traveling to the country and I met a lot of Russian, just ordinary people who didn't like those 90s. We were in the West, we were projecting our ideas and our wishful thinking that Putin, Yeltsin, is the liberator. Those movies about James Bond, who was saving the planet with a Russian beautiful agent girl, you know, against those Elon Musks, or who were those demons at that time. So we were really projecting our wishful thinking into your country, but unfortunately, in my experience as a former ambassador, and I came to Russia directly from United States, where as I was transferred from the position of the ambassador to the United States to Russia, where those people I met there were telling me, we are not Europeans, you don't understand us, we are Euro-Asians, so we have a different views. A lot of people in
Russia, myself included, who consider ourselves Europeans.
Yeah, but
so there are different.
Okay, guys.
Those guys like you are usually in the West.
I think we understood your point.
The only reason I'm here because I was in prison and they put us on the plane in Kiev.
Alexashenko is in United States. Guriev in Sorbonne. So brain drain of intelligent pro-Western people who are democratic is the real reason why Russia can't, unfortunately, in these days, be the partner of us. That's the problem.
In these days,
okay.
Nobody's arguing with that.
Vladimir, I'm really sorry, but there are a couple of questions on Slido that we haven't talked about yet and that are decisive to our topic, like the future cohesion of the Russian Federation, so-called federation, because it isn't a federation. So, and I would like maybe Evelyn to first pick this up. I mean, is there any chance that Russia stays together? Are we looking at a civil war between different components? What's the future of Russia proper?
Well, first I'm going to say that we should not be afraid of Russia falling apart per se, of the Federation falling apart per se. The way, for example, President Bush was in '91, and he was called Chicken Kyiv, you know, when he gave his speech, his famous speech in Kyiv. We shouldn't be afraid of it per se, but of course, usually when there's dissolution, there is violence, so we don't want to engineer it. We want to be careful and work with the people of the constituent, you know, work with the Russian government to make sure that there's time and space. One of the things that I did put on my paper for the first question I forgot to mention was we shouldn't rush elections, for example, because elections tend to create, if you rush them, then you're having a less democratic outcome, perhaps. So you enshrine some of the people who are in power, and also nationalist politics can come to the fore much faster than normal compromise. So I guess I would say, do I think it could occur? Yes. Certainly, if you had a more liberal democratic leader in Chechnya, that person might argue that they want their sovereignty. And that would then be a negotiation with Moscow, whether they could have autonomy or whether they would actually have their own independent state. And there are many other, of course, we know Russia's huge. The federation itself is huge. So it would be a negotiation internally. But I don't think that the international community should be afraid of Putin leaving because the federation might collapse into smaller pieces.
Okay, great. Theresa, Jeffrey Sachs is, I mean, is he an agent an agent of Russia? If he puts all the blame on the West and repeats Kremlin propaganda points?
I mean, I was based in Beijing when Jeffrey Sachs was doing his shock therapy, and I remember there were some big questions about what he was actually doing. So I think he becomes very manic when you discuss these issues. But he's carved himself an interesting career, being very anti-US, and people love hearing him, especially in Europe. He was an advisor to Joseph Borrell. So let's keep that in mind.
Unpaid advice.
I just want to pick up a couple of points here about human capital. I mean, we know throughout Russian history, every time they overinvest in the military and the secret police and underinvest in human capital, the government collapses. And this has been going on for centuries. So how many brain drains can they survive? And this is a huge problem now for Russia. And I agree with Evelyn about the idea of Francis Fukuyama's end of history, liberalism. If we just hug Russia and China close enough, they'll become just like us. And it didn't really work out that way. And so we see disgruntlement, people unhappy with the global order. And now the question is, all right, China has been salami slicing away the global order. Russia has been destroying it much more wickedly. And now we have a Donald Trump who is kind of going to destroy the rest of it. He's taking, a huge wrecking ball to the global order. So we should start asking ourselves, what are we going to do? How are we going to build the next global order? I was in DC a couple months ago, and that seems to be the hot topic. Everyone's like, how are we going to recreate the global order between China and the US? And how is Europe going to get their act together? Because they're not seen as a pole. You're too fragmented. We saw Fico. I see a question there about him on the board. So Europe is unable to get their act together. This should be one motivation to stop the fragmentation within Europe so that you actually can get a seat at the table and speak. So thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Back to Russia proper here. So why aren't the people rising up? And Vladimir, please answer shortly. What is keeping people, if Putin is so unpopular, if this is Putin's war and not Russia's war, then why aren't they doing anything?
First of all, I love the fact that the person who asked that question chose to remain anonymous.
Most of them.
Ironic. That's
most of them.
Here's just one example. 3 months ago, a man in Moscow named Yuri Kakhovets received 5 years in prison for telling a pollster on the street that he's against the war in Ukraine. This is to the question of popularity, supposed popularity of Putin. They tracked him down, identified him, they put him on trial, and they sent him away to prison for 5 years simply for saying that he's against the war. And then people are asking, why the opinion polls show that such high popularity. Opinion polls are meaningless in a totalitarian dictatorship when you know that you're going to go to prison for many years for just saying something that is not the right answer from the point of view of the authorities. And again, this is anonymous, so I don't know who's asking the question, but I'm betting that person has never lived in a totalitarian system. People who are of the older generation in this country would not be asking this question. Because if somebody asked them, why weren't there mass demonstrations against Husak on the streets of Prague in '75? Because in any society, there are not that many people who'll be willing to spend 10 years in prison for coming out to protest. Many of us did. I got a 25-year sentence for speaking out against this war. We have more than 3,000 political prisoners in Russia, many more than in the Soviet Union as a whole in the mid-'80s. So a lot of people are protesting. But I think it's sort of, that question could go for any dictatorship in any time of human history. Why didn't people
Okay.
protest? Because it's a dictatorship.
Yeah.
May I just ask
Theresa.
one quick follow-up to that? Because when I was based in Moscow from 98 to 2003, everyone's worst nightmare was to run into an Afghan veteran. So now it's going to be even worse in Russia because they've collected people from prisons and the
there are many more
horrific
of them in
atrocities.
Afghanistan. Yeah.
So some analysts have said that whoever takes over, they don't want those people to come back to Russia because, as we've seen, some of these soldiers come back and they commit terrible crimes inside Russia. So the idea to keep the war going or to find another place to use these people, how do you think that's going to happen? Because that's kind of a poison that's going to come right back to Russia. All the human rights abuses, that's just going to visit the Russian population. So how do you expect the next leader to deal with this?
That's one of the most difficult questions. You're absolutely right. I mean, Afghanistan and Chechnya put together are nothing compared to the numbers of people that are going to come back from this.
Okay, here's another interesting aspect in the Slido questions. The opposition in exile. I mean, people like Vladimir, who try to do something about their country while they're being forcibly outside their country. So what chances does the Russian opposition, the Russian Democrats, have to influence events in their country? And how can the West best help them? And please be brief.
Thank you, Roland. And first of all, I completely agree with the premise of your question. It was always a question of principle for me as a Russian politician to stay in Russia, as it was for Ilya Yashin, for Alexei Navalny, for Boris Nemtsov. That's why we never left, because I wouldn't feel I had any moral right to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up to the Putin dictatorship if I didn't do it myself. You can't do this. But now, you know, because of the exchange, of which, don't get me wrong, I'm very
Better
happy.
not go back.
I'm very happy we were released from prison, but nobody asked us our opinion even for you know, at any point. They just herded us on a plane like cattle and threw us out of Turkey last August. I think there are a lot of things that can still be done, especially since there are organizations like, for example, Memorial, who have a big constituency still inside the country. And organizations such as the Free Russia Foundation, where you and I are both a part of, that works, for example, with Russian lawyers on the ground in Russia to help find and identify Ukrainian captives who are held in Russian prison and connect them to their families and maybe help put them along in these exchanges. So there's a lot of things that can be done. But I think the most important thing that we can do, Russian Democrats, and you're right, by the way, to be cautious about the word opposition. Right, the term opposition belongs to democracies. Members of the opposition sit in parliaments, you know, debate in TV studios, run in elections. People who stand up against the regime in our country are either dead, in prison, or in forced exile. So the term opposition probably is not what we should be using. But the people who are outside, I think one of the most important tasks we do have is exactly the focus of this conversation led by you, the preparation. The preparation. Nobody knows when the Putin regime is going to end. It could be in 5 years, it could be in 2 months. That's the nature of political change in Russia. But we cannot afford to be as ill-prepared as the provisional government was in February of 1917, or Yeltsin's Democrats were in the early 90s. Because, you know, we owe this not just to ourselves, but to the world. Because without a democratic Russia, there's not going to be peace, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole. We owe it to everyone to build a normal, civilized, European democratic system in our country.
Okay, thank you very much. Petr. Yeah.
Okay.
What's your final takeaway on this question? Will Russia be a democracy, and how we're going to relate to them?
Well, I would really wish it very much. For me, when I came to Russia, that was the mission. Just try to persuade Russians that we are not enemies, that we can do a lot of things together. Of course, it was impossible because they were not interested in that. Mr. Putin is not interested in partnership. He's a KGB agent who has totally different views and dreams. So I would say that I, first of all, would wish Russia, and it's really deserve it, to be defeated. To be defeated as Germany
for its own good.
For its own good,
yeah.
As Germany was defeated, as Japan was defeated in the end of the World War II, and then to work on a total different scenario of their society. And I'm only afraid that Vladimir Sorokin is right in his Telluria, that Russia, after Putin, would collapse and would be separated in many small different states fighting among itself and themselves. So if we can help Russia, if we can do something for it, let's be stubborn, support Ukraine, don't let Russia win, and actually offer Russians this future by defeating Russia.
Thanks very much. Theresa, one sentence to conclude.
Well, I think we're in this era where the old world is dying and the new is yet to be born, quoting Gramsci, and now we are in the time of monsters. So I think that I had lived in Russia for 5 years. I follow it closely, and I think that hopefully with foresight and leadership, but I was there in Moscow at the time when technical assistance to the CIS, I don't know if some of you are European officials here or remember TASIS, and it was a fantastic program. They poured millions and millions into Russia, and then people just wonder, what does that mean? How come things didn't go so well? So I don't know what the solution is, but I hope with all these great minds on this panel, we'll come up with a better solution.
Definitely. I'll do the takeaways at the very end. Evelyn, one last sentence. And Vladimir, you have had a lot of space, fortunately. So, Evelyn.
I mean, I would just really underline what the good ambassador said. Really, the best way out of our current situation is to defeat Russia in Ukraine, because not only the security of Europe depends on it, and the national security and the interests and the values of the United States, but also Asia Pacific. China's watching, Taiwan's watching. We have to really feel the urgency. And yes, it's true that Putin's on war footing. And so after Ukraine, if Putin is still in the Kremlin, no one is safe in Europe. But hopefully, if we defeat him in the right way, there will be a change in government.
Great. So I will just present the 3 decisive points of this debate. What we couldn't agree on is, was the West too nice or not nice enough to Russia in the 90s? But I think we do all agree that in the time of monsters, we need to prevail. The freedom needs to prevail, and Putin has to lose this in Ukraine. And finally, Russia will be a free country. The West is not good. This has to be done by Russians themselves. That's nothing the West can do at the push of a button, but the West has a certain influence and it should use it wisely. And I'll leave you with that. This was our last session for today. For those of you who are invited to the award ceremony, the buses leave at 7 p.m. And we start again here in this room tomorrow at 9:10 with AI deployment. All right. So I think we had a great debate here. We could continue this. We will continue this. Thank you all, Petr, Vladimir, Evelyn, and Theresa. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I want to get a photo.